Today's sermon is entitled, Love Chooses the Disempowered, Sheep and Shepherds and You and Me. You don't know this, but I used to raise sheep on the farm in the Midwest in Illinois, actually. So you could call me a shepherd if you wanted to. I didn't call myself a shepherd. I was a farmer's daughter. That's what I was. And my dad thought it would be good for me to learn to have a little business and learn to have a checking account and pay bills, because I had to pay the shearer of my sheep and I had to pay for the feed. And then I got money when we sold the wool and so forth. So then I would show them in 4-H every year. I have to tame them. So I have had lanolin on these hands every summer for about 5 or 6 summers. I know about sheep. I don't really like them, but I know about them. And they are, so I can tell you, they're good grass lawnmowers. They eat the grass. It's going to get back to the Bible story in a minute. They eat the grass really close to the ground. And what that means is that shepherds, you have to look far and wide for enough pasture for sheep, because they just eat it so well. So that explains why shepherds have to oftentimes be on the move and get farther and farther away from home. So sheep, of course, are in the Christmas story. And the shepherds were in the field at night because they had wandered so far away trying to find grass for those animals that they couldn't get back, because, after all, sheep do not run very fast. In fact, they're pretty defenseless. The only defense they have is all this thick wool, but a good predator knows there's meat under that wool, and so they'll just tear into it anyway. So what sheep do when they're threatened is they huddle in a circle, and they huddle close to like they're going to try to disappear in that flock of sheep, and then they try to run. But they're not fast, and so they give the impression of being pretty dumb, but actually they're just defenseless. And they need shepherds for protection. You could say that without a shepherd they were pretty disempowered. Indeed, aren't we all? That seems to be lesson number 1. Let's move on. So it was on such a night that the shepherds awakened to hear and see an angelic being in the sky telling a strange story about the birth of a king. And who could possibly go to sleep after that, right? So, well, let's go to Bethlehem and see whether or not this is really true. My suspicion is that they put the youngest shepherd in charge of the sheep and left him in the fields, and then they went down to the city to see what was going on. We're going to return to that story in just a little bit. I'm going to shift gears and talk about Luke, because it is Luke that we find this story. Luke cares a lot about disempowered people. Matthew does not. The story of the nativity in Matthew is about the wise men, because Matthew is writing for a very Jewish audience, and he wanted to make sure that his audience knew that this is about the Messiah. So he brings in the heavy-duty, the wise men from the east. We don't find that story in Luke. We only find the story of the shepherds, whom I'm saying are disempowered. I used to always think that Luke was really very special until I started working on this sermon, and then it came down a little bit in my estimation, which I'll explain a little bit. Because I knew he had a lot of stories in there about women. More stories about women in this book than any other. There are 23 stories, actually. And another 17 stories that he gets from Mark, because he's using Mark to add and write his story. So he writes so many stories about women that there are people who think, scholars think, that he probably had some sources that came from women themselves. And that's exciting. How else would he know about what Mary was thinking and Anna was thinking and so forth? So we have, in that nativity story, we have Elizabeth's story, we have Mary's story, and we have Anna's story. 3 women. Then while others in the scripture talk about the sons of Abraham, Luke, the author of Luke, calls, the bent-over woman is the daughter of Abraham. You don't see that anywhere else in the Bible. Elizabeth is called one of the daughters of Aaron, and Anna in the temple is called the daughter of Phanuel. He includes the forgiven prostitute who anoints Jesus, the Galilean women who follow him, the women at the cross, the women preparing spices. Luke is obviously highlighting women in this book. Now, I'm just about ready to pronounce this guy a feminist, way ahead of his time, and then I read the Women's Bible Commentary, who points out that the writer, the third generation writer now, okay, he has an agenda too. And his idea is, yes, let's elevate the women in the early stories of Jesus, but let's make sure that they're not role models. So these women are prayerful, quiet, grateful women, supportive of male leadership, and they do not have a prophetic ministry. So although he's pulling the story out of Mark, lots of stories about Mark, he leaves out the one about the feisty Syrophoenician woman who talks back to Jesus. No woman challenges Jesus in this book. In addition, there are 133 men who are named in Luke, and only 10 women are named. That's 13 to 1. There are 7 women in Acts, which is also written by the same person, but only one woman, Mary, is mentioned in Luke. That's also in both of them. So the lessons 2 and 3 might be about disempowerment. Not being seen is disempowering for people. And not being named is also disempowering for people. But there are other ways to disempower people. Let's bring this into today. I missed out on last week's service because I was at a conference that included a lot of transgender people. These are people who do not fit neatly into the male or female box and the roles because that's not how they're wired biologically or mentally. So I heard lots of stories about exclusion. One person who had both a male and a female name on the name tag said, and was a member of the Episcopal Church. And this person said that the Book of Common Prayer is very painful when it refers explicitly to male and female. So when this happens, this Christian person takes out a large sheet of paper that is kept in the backpack and writes these words on it. I am neither male nor female, but I am a child of God. And he proceeds to put it on his or her back. This person wants to know if the church is really going to be inclusive. Do you really see me? Another trans person noted that so many liberal and progressive churches say, this was really rather painful for me as a liberal progressive to sit there and listen to this, okay? Said, all are welcome here is what the last message is. But upon becoming part of that community, has discovered that those welcome cards are counterfeit. These are disempowered people and they're on the margins of society through no fault of their own. And they're trying to find a place to belong. Like the sheep, they're disempowered. Like the poor shepherds, they're disempowered. Like Luke's women, they're disempowered. Another example. December 17th is a day that's been set aside to remember all of these sex workers who have been murdered throughout the world, and to pray about the violence that is aimed at them. For example, in New York City, 80% of the sex workers have experienced violence, and 27% of this has come from the police force itself. In India, 70% of the sex workers report being abused by police, and 80% had been arrested with no evidence whatsoever. In Russia, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe, less than 25% of the sex workers believe they can report assault to police. All these statistics come from the Sex Workers Outreach Project in their Day to End Violence fact sheet. And of course, we know that those with darker skin and those who are sexual minorities are disproportionately targeted for violence, whether they're on the street or just trying to live their lives. Violence is a way to keep disempowered people or marginalized people disempowered. It kind of goes together. Keep them silenced, push them to the outer edge of the margin, and don't pay attention to what happens there. Back to Luke. The author of Luke, however, cares a lot about the disempowered, even if he may not want to empower women of that generation. In the Global Bible Commentary, Dr. Renee Kruger says that the author of Luke is declaring that those who are poor because the rich have made them poor. The hungry are hungry because those who are satisfied have made them hungry. Those who cry do so because those who laugh make them cry. And the persecuted suffer because the prestigious, flattered, and famous persecute them. Listen now to the words of Luke in chapter 6. The blesseds are countered with the woes. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Jesus is speaking here. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you, defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven, for that is what their ancestors did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. And woe to you when all speak well of you, for that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets. The real issue for Luke is not to announce the poor among us or to judge the rich, but to move into a space that creates an ethic about how to respond to the haves and the have-nots, to the powerful and the disempowered. And for Luke, it's about generosity, the ethic of sharing. Luke has an understanding of two gods. One is the God of the poor, and one is the God of the rich, and one has a capital G, and one has a little g. There is God or there is mammon, or money, for this author. And he's quite clear that there's a huge abyss between the two, between the powerful and the poor who are disempowered. Remember the story of rich man and Lazarus, okay? Because for this author, that Jesus stands in complete solidarity with the poor and judges the uncompassionate rich. According to Dr. Kruger, there's no such thing as an isolated poor person, nor is there an independent or innocent rich person. He writes that Luke is a frontal assault on the entire rich class that exploits and oppresses. I'm so tempted to go to politics at this point, but I won't. But just think about the headlines that you're reading. So, as Christians, we dare not allow some people to get kicked to the curb, to get kicked to the margins, and left to live in poverty or be abused by those in power. Syrian refugees come to mind at the moment. Immigrants come to mind at the moment. Poor and rural women needing reproductive health care come to mind. Our question is, how shall we respond to power? Power over. That's the way of the world. Power of domination, and it creates disempowered people. But I suspect none of us actually believes we're part of the rich class, and few of us feel we're part of the class that oppresses and exploits either. But I have specifically used a couple of examples of those in and around our community who certainly have less power than we do in this place, whether they're living on the streets or working on the streets, those who live with violence aimed at them through no fault of their own, whether it's race or gender or orientation or immigration status. We can always find some people who have less power than we do, always. Whether we feel powerful or not is irrelevant. They are among us. That's the challenge of Luke's gospel. Can we live it, is the question. Can we move to the margins with the disempowered? Let's be clear, the world will disempower all of us, all right? But liberation theologians remind us that God is to be found on those margins with those disempowered people. The Luke story tells us that a group of people, small group of people like shepherds, were disempowered by the Roman Empire, and yet they were the ones who got the story. They were the ones who saw the angels. They were the ones who heard the music promising. It's the paradox of Christianity. It's Jesus turning the world standards upside down. Remember, Jesus taught that the grand shall be brought low and the lowly shall be raised high. The Apostle Paul talks about it. The wisest of the world thinks what we're about is folly, but our folly is the wisdom. Okay? It's the reversal of what the world assumes and how the world lives. That's what we've committed to follow. The world only understands power over. Men over women, straight people over sexual minorities, those with money over those who none, citizens over immigrants, white people over people of color, healthy people over differently abled people, sexual conformity over sexual diversity. Okay. For Luke, we escape this world of domination way of thinking by giving. By compassionate sharing, it moves us out to the edge. That's where the shepherds are. And that's where the sheep are. It does not matter how the world views us, because on the margins we are reminded God calls us by name. God never abandons or forsakes us. Doesn't matter if the world does. God does not. Or as the kids say, God is in our corner. Today's nativity story tells us that God reaches out to the sheep and the shepherds among us, to all the disempowered, with the good news. And the good news says, I see you, I know you, you are mine. Like the shepherds, our message is to go and look where you least expect it. And we might find God in our midst. Divinity in human form. Go and look and find in unusual places, in a cattle stall, in the projects of North Philadelphia, in a human body, in a sexual body, in an abused body, in a poor body. Look and find it in a gay youth surviving on the streets, the Syrian refugee with a child on his back, the sex worker trying to pay the bills the best way she knows how, the immigrant in Pennsylvania fields trying to create a better life for her children, the black church busing homeless people in for meals, leaders in struggling nonprofits learning to raise funds, an Indian in the Midwest teaching boxing to kids, trying to keep them off the streets and out of drugs. God is to be found in unexpected places that the world overlooks, on those margins where disempowered people are. As a well-known preacher, John Chrysostom, said, if you can't find Jesus in the beggar at the door of your church, you cannot find him in the chalice on the altar. God is found in our sharing, in the giving of ourselves to create the realm of God on earth as it is in heaven. This is the gospel story. Love is found in the service to one another. Love is found in the paradox of being the opposite of the way the world operates. Love is found on those margins. And when we decide we're on the side of love, it is never about power over. It is always about mutual empowerment. In the midst, it's the midst of the power of God. It's here, on the inside of us. God in the flesh, living here in these bodies. It's not the world's power, and the world can't take it away. It is spirit, living spirit. When we cast our lot on the side of love, then we may hear the music of the angels singing, glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace. We may find we need to pick ourselves up to follow this song to the nearest manger, to the nearest poor person, to a place of service that's on the margins. And then we are empowered, and our work empowers others. For then, when we live in love, we know that love has reached us, has found us, has called us by name, and is singing a new song to us, promising a new world to us. Make a new world. Be a new world. Can you hear it? Amen.